for about 4 to 5 years now. And he was with Lead for 3 years, I think, and then he left when we were there for some reason. And now he's with Good Business Lab now. So when some of you reached out to me for CV writing, I immediately thought of Jagan because he has been very helpful to me also. And we have had these conversation, and he also appreciates the idea of Gaussian economists. So yeah, and Jagan did his BA in economics and then master's in public policy. After that, he has been working as research associate and research manager. So I will let Jagan begin now. If any of you are not at all comfortable with Hindi and you want the entire session to be in English, then please let us know in chat. If you're comfortable with both Hindi and English, I think that's good, right, Jagan?
Yes, that sounds good to me. So I'll try and restrict myself largely to English, but as a matter of habit, I may just dive into Hindi once in a while. But I will, yes, okay, Vinay. I think Vinay again, sorry, I got your name wrong, but I will stick to English then. Yes. Cool. Sound good. So I think we can begin, right? Awesome. Great. So hi everyone. I think when Ati reached out and we were thinking of structuring this as a 1 hour session largely, and this is sort of just a primer into how you should approach writing your CVs when you're applying for jobs, especially right out of sort of grad school and sort of you maybe sort of going into your first job and how you should write if you're sort of applying for your first job, and also if you're moving jobs, what are additional tips to keep in mind? Some of these are pretty common sense and sort of just good practices to keep in mind. And just sort of based on my experience, having hired sort of research associates for the last couple of years, I think this is something that I have really felt, even from a hiring perspective, helps me get the best candidates we're looking for, right? And then what we can do is I'll show you an example of my CV and my resume, and then we can sort of dissect as to why things are in a particular order and why they're not in a particular order. And I'm happy to then take questions. I mean, if you have any questions while the session is going on, please feel free to raise your hand and I can sort of respond to them. But in any case, I will take continuous breaks and on and off, just sort of keep asking if there's any question that I can address. And I think post the session, if any of you sort of want any assistance from me to improve your CV or your resumes, I'm more than happy to sort of be around and speak to you on that as well. Cool. So having said that, I think it's just to begin with the basics. I think there is a fair bit of sort of confusion around what CVs and what's a CV and what's a resume. But largely, I think what a CV is a much more long form, in-depth document that describes all your career steps. Right? So everything from education and the kind of work you do, especially for people who've sort of been in a job market for a few years, all the roles that you sort of performed, and in details a description of the roles that you do. Right? A resume is a much shorter form. It's sort of typically very specific to a particular job you apply, and it should always sort of be very sort of concise because that is something that hiring managers typically appreciate, right? So again, the confusion sort of comes from the fact that in Europe, CVs and resumes are sort of used interchangeably. So they typically mean the same thing. And what they're asking for there is your CV, unless otherwise mentioned that we want your CV not more than 2 pages, right? So that's where largely the confusion sort of arises from, is that in Europe, sort of there is that sort of common use of the same term. But in the US and in most cases in India as well, I think there is a distinction fairly made, but there's a fair bit of confusion about what a CV and what a resume is, right? So I think having sort of cleared that, so just in terms of what a CV and so the difference between a CV and a resume, I think obviously the first one is the length itself, right? CVs typically can go up to 4 or 5 pages depending on one's experience. Obviously, if you sort of right out of your master's and applying for your first job, your CV, even in that case, should not exceed more than 2.5 pages, unless you've already have a lot of projects that you're working on and you want to showcase that, and as you should. So unless that's the case, you should definitely highlight your education and highlight the projects and the courses that you've taken and all of that. But if you write out of sort of masters in applying for first job, even your CV do not exceed more than 2.5. It's just a rule of thumb. But if you sort of have a fair bit of experience, I think you can go up to 4 or 5 pages, because especially people who are asking for your CVs, they actually are very interested in understanding your whole career path, right? So that's pretty much the purpose why they ask for. But typically, when you're applying for jobs, most of them will ask you for a resume, and which is typically 2 pages. But if you write out of your masters again, try and restrict it to a page and a half, unless in absolute sort of different circumstances where you have additional material to share in your resume, and you want to sort of put down all of that in a paper, right? That's just sort of the basic difference between what a CV and a resume, right? Again, the purpose sort of, as I was mentioning earlier, it's resumes are very tailor-made and they're sort of specific to a job that you're applying to, whereas CV is a little more comprehensive overview. Typically, when you're applying for PhD programs abroad, they would ask you for your CV, and that is where you need to be as detailed as possible. Right? So all the projects you've worked on, all the professors you've worked with, and all your experiences, all your field work, highlight all the key sort of keywords that you have. Right. So that is something that's to keep in mind. That typically most of sort of the job market at least will ask you for a resume and not your CV. But if someone does say CV, uh, just clarify that they actually mean a CV and not a resume. In most cases, they're likely to confuse between a CV and a resume. Right. Another thing to keep in mind that try and not have the same CV that you. So don't prepare just one CV and apply to 5 or 6 places. It's always good practice to invest some time in your CV and cater to every job that you have, because every job uh, has sort of their specific requirements, and you want to tailor make your sort of resume to that sort of job opening, right? And always use the buzzwords and the keywords that the job description itself has. Uh, so that's sort of broadly what a CV and a resume are. So any questions before I move on? Either you can raise your hand or you can post on the chat box and I can reply to them.
Hi, I had a question.
Yes.
So, when university, I might have missed this, you might have mentioned it. I'm sorry if that's the case. So, when universities ask for our CVs, universities abroad, do they mean CVs or resume?
They actually mean the CV. So they want the long form because they want to know in detail sort of all your research experience and all your educational background, all of that. So you would typically sort of provide all of that outside your transcripts as well. So in your CV, you would restrict your education to your undergrad and your masters if you have both. But if you just have undergrad, you only have your undergrad. Typically, you don't actually. So once you sort of in your undergrad or completed your, I mean, sorry, in your masters or completed your masters, you typically don't sort of, at least in your CV and resume, it's very unusual to sort of report your 10th and 12th sort of schooling and marks there. But so that's something that you'd anyway do with your transcripts, but restricted to the case of applying to sort of PhD programs, they would typically ask for a CV. Cool. Are there any other questions? Okay, so if that's the case, I'm going to sort of move on quickly. So just sort of simple tips on how do you write a resume, right? So there's something called a 6 second rule, and there's sort of extensive evidence that in today's day and age sort of exists that hiring managers typically decide within the first 6 seconds if the resume is going to go past the first screen, right? Now the first screen is very important because that's essentially when you are able to make that first impression, right? And that's sort of very important. So it's important to keep in mind that if you were always keep yourself or put yourself in the position of a hiring manager and keep in mind the 6 second rule, right? So when you look at when you open the document, you're going to just give yourself 6 seconds and see whether that sort of you were able to pass the first initial level of screening, right? And then sort of obviously every job I think would typically sort of there would be at least 20-25 applicants, and that is something that sort of is very uh, sort of common, right? And that being the case, there would typically be a first round of screening where they would look at initial fit in itself, right? So do they have the same background? Do they have the some bit of experience if a job actually calls for an experience, right? So that's something that you should keep in mind, that the 6-second rule is very important, and this is something that all applicants are actually taught, especially in, I mean, you look at sort of MBA schools, and this is something that's very common, that they tell you that the 6-second rule, your CV should pop out in the first 6 seconds, right? And so that is something that you should always keep in mind. So there are some tricks that you can sort of have, and I'll sort of get to that as to how can you sort of navigate through a 6-second rule, right? So how do you ensure that you're sort of grabbing the hiring lead's attention, right? First things, I think it's very important that you know what the job position is, what the opening is for, and you need to understand what's the company or the organization you're applying to, what they do, and also what's the best sort of skill set that they're looking for, right? So what the skills that they look for, and the best indication for the skills that an opening or an organization is looking for is typically found in the job description. So they would sort of explicitly tell you this is the skills we're looking for, and this is sort of what we want to do. And we either want people experience, we're okay with freshers, we want people with a particular skill set, we're okay. So they would say preferable. So typically, let's say in the research environment, I would say having Stata knowledge is preferable, but we're happy to also get hire people who have sort of knowledge of Python or R, right? So that's sort of what it is. So it's important that you always check the boxes that are the preferable or desirable, and anything above that is definitely in the advantage, right? So if you know Stata, Python, R, always mention all three, but make sure that you mention Stata, which is their preferred or desirable skill set that they want, right? So that's first thing. Second, have clear and crisp sections, right? You should sort of have uh, your resume or your CV sort of typically divided into clear sections. So there's education, there's research experience, if you have past work experience, internship experience, and any other things, right? So that's sort of, you should have clear sections so that when a hiring lead is looking at it, she or he knows that this is sort of what I'm looking for. So if I'm looking for someone who has a particular kind of education experience, so let's say I'm looking for someone from sociology background, I would directly go there. My eyes would directly take me to that, right? And I can sort of initially filter if someone's coming from a sociology background or economics background, right? Now, the question here is then how do I ensure that someone's getting the right section, right? And again, sort of very sort of typical advice is to use two colors, right? So have a section color which says education experience or past work experience, internship experience, research experience, and have those headers in a particular color, and then your normal text can be in black, right? So that immediately sort of tells the person who's looking at this at your resume, okay, this is sort of where I need to go to, and this is sort of the kind of information I need for the initial screen, right? Because if my initial screening is that I need students who have background in economics, or I need students who've completed their masters or are going to complete the masters, I will directly go to education section, right? I mean, if I have to spend time to sort of look at the whole CV, a hiring manager likely to actually not look at it, right? So that is something that you should keep in mind, that these colors are very important, right? Of course, while I say use colors, don't sort of go over artistic on it and sort of use all colors that are there. Typically use only two colors, right? So your black should be a text, and you have your header, which is typically blue, right? And I'll actually show you an example of my CV, and we can sort of dissect that a little further, right? Uh, Two sort of pointers to keep in mind: that never use red in your CV, and sort of not too flashy colors, right? So no sort of pink or sort of fluorescent green, fluorescent yellow, nothing like that, right? It should grab attention, but it shouldn't shout out too much as well. So it's a fine balancing game there. So again, another way you can do this is to use two types of fonts, right? you could typically use Times New Roman, and you could use Arial for your heading, let's say, right? Again, don't use too fancy fonts. Don't use Garamount, a bunch of those things, because if these fonts are too fancy, hiring managers sort of typically are just distracted with that, right? So the trick here is to grab someone's attention and in the first 6 seconds, and not sort of have them distracted. So that's sort of what you would do, right? So these are sort of quick tips on how do you navigate through the 6 second rule. Any questions at this point? Okay, so that sort of, if that's the case, then maybe you can move on, and if there are any questions, we can circle back to this, right? So having sort of said sort of what sort of are the best practices, there's some sort of common pitfalls you should always avoid, right? And these in some sense are sort of non-negotiables while writing a resume, right? Obviously, I mean, some of these are very obvious. Avoid typos and spelling mistakes. So one way of sort of ensuring that you're sort of avoiding typos and spelling mistakes is to complete writing your CV or resume, take a break and come back with a fresh set of eyes, right? And spot any typos that are there. Typically, this works because if you've sort of done all of it in one session, you will not find these mistakes. These mistakes can be super, super common, right? It's probably an extra S, or there is a the missing, or there's an off missing, and you sort of don't catch that if you're in the same writing session, right? So finish your initial writing session, and then close the document, take a break, and come back, and you can sort of revisit the document yourself. Alternatively, what you should do is ask a friend to go through your CV or your resume, and just ask them whether they can spot any typos or not, right? And that's another way of ensuring that there are no typos there, right? So this is as something as sort of basic as ensuring that your spell checks are done and there are no sort of grammatical mistakes and all that, right? Another sort of common sort of thing I see people confusing with is the use of tense, right? So there's a simple thumb rule. If it is something that you've done in the past, always use a past tense. And if this is something that you're currently doing, or it's a current role, always use a present tense, right? And that's a simple rule of thumb. So avoid using present continuous, but present continuous is okay, but typically try to restrict yourself to past and present tenses, right? So that's something to keep in mind. The simple rule of thumb: if you're currently doing something, uh, stick to present tense. If you've completed something or you've done something in the past, always use past tense, right? So that is something that's to keep in mind. Then another thing is always avoid first person, right? So rather than writing I participated / conducted a primary research project, you should write participated / conducted a primary research project, right? So always avoid using sort of first person here, right? So I, we, that is something that you should not do, right? So if you have, let's say, a research project with co-authors, you would say participated / conducted a primary research project with XYZ. So let's say with Aditi Priya, for example, right? So that is what you would do. So that's number 3. Number 4, always send your resumes and CV as a PDF. Always. Now, there are 2 reasons why this is the case, right? If you're sending it as a Word file, given sort of how Microsoft operates, and given that there are different operating systems, your alignments can get messed up when you send it over email or when you apply, right? So your PDF ensures that doesn't happen, right? So always sort of send your resumes and CVs in a PDF, right? That is a cardinal sort of mistake that most first time applicants make. And this is something, this is something as simple as which format to send, really sort of uh, makes the difference, right? Because you have to always keep in mind that you're in an environment when your resume is sort of in a pool of 30 resumes, right? So if I have to make an additional effort to sort of open, and then the format is missing, so I'll more likely than not move to the next candidate, right? So keep in mind that you're getting a best shot to get the first foot into the door. Once you've done that, then it's about sort of what your resume has to say. Then it's about a bunch of your skill set, where skill set matches, all of that, right? But it's to ensure that that first hurdle is passed. These are sort of common things that you should do, right? Another thing, another common mistake I see very often is that you always, I think, especially with people coming right out of masters, they would always automatically share reference, right? You should never do that, right? So what you should do, you should say if references are required, they can be made available if requested. So you sort of write a statement. References can be made available if requested, right? So don't add the references directly, right? So you don't want to do that because for sometimes I mean either they can be missed or you also don't get a heads up if someone's going to reach out, right? So while you might sort of have told your referee that, hey, I'm going to use a name for application, if you're applying to multiple jobs and multiple people will try calling them, then they might get confused. So the best thing to do is always say references can be made available if requested. And if someone does request, you can actually give your referee a heads up by saying, hey, company X is going to call you regarding my application. It would be great if you could give me a good review. And so it's already in their memory that, okay, company X is going to sort of call, let's say for someone, let's say Ishika or Arvind or other people, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So that's why sort of it's recommended that you don't have your references already on your CV or your resume, but always write the statement that if references are required, it can be made available, right? So that's sort of another thing to take care of. Cool. So that's sort of simple, sort of 6 principles to keep in mind as to what not to do. So I'll pause here a little bit, and if there are any questions, I can answer them. Okay, I maybe see. Okay. So to take back to the first point, summer schools and online course classes worth mentioning in a CV? Yes, absolutely. You should definitely sort of include summer schools and online courses slash classes in your CV and resume. Why is that the case, right? Online courses and summer schools typically are some kind of skill upgradation, right? So it could be that you're coming right out of your masters and you've done, let's say for example the JPAL EDX program, which is on RCTs, right? And if you're applying for a research job that is looking for candidates with knowledge of RCT, that's automatically a signal that you have a fair bit of knowledge coming in of RCTs and how do you do field projects and all of that, right? So it's always worthwhile that you include online courses and summer schools, right? And of course, you want to be very strategic about what you put in. Um, and again, as another advice is always go back to job description and see what's the skills that they are looking for, and based on that, you can sort of choose. Let's say you've done a handful of online courses. Maybe you don't want to add all of them, but you want to add those that add value to your application, right? So that's the strategy that I would sort of advise you to do, right? Okay, great, awesome. Any other questions that I can answer at this point? Um, how important is mentioning MA score? Honestly, not so much. Uh, I don't think people. It's not a convention anymore. Honestly, again, this is sort of very specific to which kinds of job you're applying to. Um, I don't think you need to necessarily always say what your MA and BA scores are, and I think that is perfectly fine, right? As long as you mention which course you're doing, if there is some sort of specialization what you're doing, and which college it is, I think it's fine. But if they, I mean, I don't really see people. I mean, it's sort of become very obsolete, but you can sort of let go of that. So it's not an absolute necessity. But if you feel as an individual that that is going to make your case stronger, you can do that. So there's no hard and fast rule. It's not a necessity, but if you think that sort of mentioning your scores is going to strengthen your application, by all means do that. So, but I as a hiring manager actually never look at these things, because I mean, marks, I mean, they sort of have a particular value, and honestly, the job market, at least according to me, they hold no value, right? It's just about sort of what skills you come with. Cool. Any other questions, or otherwise I can move on? And maybe, I mean, if there are other questions, we can definitely circle back to this. Okay, so if that's the case, now so we know what not to do. So in some sense, let's get to what we should do, right? Always mention people that you work with, right? So professors, industry leaders, anyone that is of any sort of worth their salt, you should always mention them, right? And this is typically called name dropping. So if you work with a professor, let's say in a particular university, and that professor is fairly well known and well regarded, you should definitely use them, right? Because what that does is that actually establishes some bit of credibility of the things you're saying about your skills, right? So if you're saying something that saying that I know a good bit of field research, I understand field research context, uh, and then you say I work with, let's say, XYZ, and XYZ are well regarded in that field, that's going to just add credibility to the kind of things you say, right? So that's one. And the second bit is, if sort of the places you're applying to know the people that you sort of mention in your resume, it's likely they can say, okay, maybe I'll just informally speak to this person. Hey, this person's applied to this job. How do you like this, right? And this could be professor, this could be senior colleagues, any one of that matter of fact, right? And that is something that you should always do. So an example would be, if you've done a research project, let's say with John Race, right? So you say conducted a field research project across Bihar with John Race in 2019, right? And that gives you credibility there, right? Because everyone knows John Race, everyone knows how serious he is, and the kind of learning he imparts with the people he works, right? So that's something that you definitely do, right? So have a logical structure to the resume. Now, what does this mean? So this is sort of very important, right? Always sort of at the top, you should have some kind of a skill summary, right? And that's essentially point 4. So essentially, these are these key sort of words that hiring leads are looking for, and that is something that is immediately going to pop, right? So it could be a skill, it could be something to do with your academic learning, or some tool that you know, anything of that sort. You should always do that, right? And especially if you're coming right out of your master's, your second section, so after the skill summary section, your second section should always be your education, right? But if you have a fair bit of work experience, your work experience is something that should come first, right? Because for me, for example, right, so when if I were to apply to a new job, hiring managers are more likely to be interested in my past work experience than my education, which is at this point 5 years back, right? So they don't really, I mean, it's not as relevant as my sort of immediately sort of previous job experiences, right? So that logical structure is very important, right? So to keep in mind that what is sort of most relevant is it what you should always showcase first, right? So especially for people coming right out of masters or undergrad, if you're applying to a job, this is something your education section should always be number 2. Your number 1 should be a skill summary, number 2 should be your education, right? And education should be in reverse chronology. Hold on. So I have someone on the chat. Do we need to spell out the skills if we have work experience? Yes, absolutely. And I'll actually show you maybe an example of a skill summary, right? It doesn't sort of matter if you have work experience or not. When you're trying to apply to a new job, people are always looking for skills that match the requirement, right? So even though you might sort of be working in the same ecosystem, and maybe the skills are sort of common, but there are always alternatives to a skill, right? For example, if you're using a coding language, there are multiple coding languages available. So maybe a particular job is only looking for someone with our experience, right, or with our knowledge. So you should never assume that just because I've worked in an environment that's similar to the kind of environment I'm going to apply to, that doesn't mean that they automatically understand that you have fair sort of understanding of art, right? So you should always mention that you know art, and that is something that's useful, right? So that's something to keep in mind, that your logical structure is sort of super important. Is it necessary to mention personal details like father's name, date of birth, and that? In a CV, yes. In a resume, no. In a CV, you can. Again, this is sort of very old convention that people add personal details. So name, age, sex, father's name. It's fairly old convention. I don't think it's sort of seen anymore, honestly. But if you really do have to, you can mention it at the very last as another section, right? So that is something that's honestly gone out of convention, and you can sort of avoid it unless in a CV it's explicitly mentioned that also present your personal details. If that's not the case, you can sort of fairly well you can avoid it, right? And if someone is curious about that information, they can always reach out to you, right? And that should be fine. Part of it sort of obviously comes from the fact that that information is actually useless to a lot of people in general, right? I mean, what am I going to do by knowing how old you are? I mean, honestly, that shouldn't matter, right? So that's pretty much sort of why people don't do that. Cool. So Arvind Kumar asks, how long should the word description be? Uh, yes, I'll actually give an example, but typically 2 to 3 lines, and they should have, and that's the next one. They should have action words, so verbs in that. So work description again, it's for each project. So if you sort of have multiple roles in the project, then you should mention that. And I'll actually walk you through the example that I have, and maybe that will make it clear. But typically, about 3 to 4 lines should be more than enough, right? And you should always sort of, some best practices there is always to use action words there, right? So then the next point is always cater your resume to the job you're applying to. So never, I think one common mistake a lot of us make while applying to multiple openings is to just create one CV template or one resume template and just send it off to everyone. Well, that's efficient in some way because you don't have to sort of spend time every time, but it's sort of good to understand what a job requirement is, and try and sort of redesign your CV a little bit if required, right? Maybe it's not, in that case it's fine, but in a lot of cases, again, as I was sort of answering earlier, if you sort of have a lot of online courses and if you're only selecting to add a few, based on which sort of job opening you're applying to, maybe you want to remove a few, add a few, and then sort of present it, right? So it's always good to uh, revisit your resume every time to apply to your new job, right? It shouldn't be that, okay, here is my resume. I know this is sort of what I'm going to use, and this is what I'm going to send to everyone. That sort of, it doesn't. I mean, it's okay, but you can always improve it. And this is sort of one way. So understanding the job description and sort of changing it, right? So that's one thing that should definitely do. Again, as I was mentioning, include a skill summary at the beginning, and that is something that is sort of super important, right? Another thing to keep in mind that things should always be in reverse chronology, right? So if you've done your undergrad and pursuing your masters or completed your masters, so your master should come first and then your undergrad, right? Even in terms of work experience, the most recent should come first, and then you should go back to your past, right? So let's say you had multiple let's say you had 2 jobs and you're applying to a third one. So your most recent job should come first and then the one later, right? Then, because that way hiring managers can actually look at the progression that you make, right? So which is why it's sort of advised always that you use reverse chronology. So that being said, I think the last point is that you should use action words, right? And sort of, so led a team, or sort of managed, analyzed. These are sort of words that really sort of send out the message of the task that you take, right? Rather than saying I managed, you can just say managed XYZ, and that's something that you can do, right? So these are sort of some quick tips on writing a resume or a CV. So maybe I can pause here to answer any questions that may be there, and then we can actually see my CV and resume to just look at sort of what could potentially be like a good example. Yes, I think.
Jagan, I don't know if you have mentioned this, but could you also speak a little about publications in case you have where it should be mentioned in? And do you think
Yeah.
chronology should be followed there, or one should look at the journal ranking and then put it in that order?
Okay. Publication. I'll maybe take the other question together as well. So that is doing to produce certificate for achievements. Publications, achievements. Okay. Um, so yes, on the publication bit, I think where they get positioned is sort of specific to a job, right? So if you're applying, if you're right out of your master's or your undergrad, and you have a publication or a working paper, it's okay to include it either right after education or right after your internship experience, right? But if you have a fair bit of work experience, I think what people look for, unless it's a very publication specific role where they're looking to hire you as, let's say, a senior economist or something of that sort, then of course publication, the role sort of is very important, and that comes back to sort of the logical structure. So there's some judgment call to be made there. But if that's not the case, and you have a fair bit of work experience, I think you can have your work experience, your publication, and then education, right? And that's something that's okay. I think that's a similar case, Arvind, with achievements as well. I think you don't need to provide sort of any certificate, because people will normally just trust you. I mean, one thing, I mean, something I did mention is that you do not lie in your CVs and resumes, right? Because that's something that you should never do. That's a cardinal sin to sort of commit, right? So people will just typically sort of uh, trust that what you say on your CV or resume is true. So that being said, I think the treatment for achievements is slightly different to publications. You can actually have it as the last section, right? Maybe right before the reference where you write references can be made available if requested. Right above that, you can just have your past achievements, right? And past achievements, again, should be in reverse chronology. If you've already in your masters, only include those that are in your undergrad and masters. If you're in your undergrad, you can likely go up to 11th or 12th, but not before that. Right? So if you've sort of had some award in your 8th or 9th grade, unless it's an extremely prestigious award, right? Unless it's so rare that you only let's say 20 people every year achieve it. So that's an achievement to always have, right? But if it's not as rare, you should always sort of have achievements that don't go too far in the past, right? So if you're in your masters, include achievements in your masters, and in the undergrad, if you're in your undergrad and maybe 11th and 12th at best, not before that, unless of course the caveat being that if something is super unique and it's extremely prestigious, you should always include that, right? um Arvind, Aditi, does that answer your question?
Hi, Jagan. I had a question.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Asif. Yeah.
If I know a different statistical software like R, Python, but I am not expertise in any of it, but I know better R than Python. So how do I convey that I know R better than Python or
Right.
LaTeX?
Yeah. So what you should do, you can definitely grade it. So let's say you know multiple languages. So let's say you know R, Python, and Stata, right? And let's say you know Python extremely well. So you would say Python in bracket or after a hyphen advanced, and then you would say Stata and R intermediate or beginners, right? So that's something that you can do. So you can, by grading that, uh, you sort of informing, okay, this is something that I'm extremely good at, but I know other languages, but not as good as Python. But Python is my primary language of coding.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah. In the same lines, I think another thing to keep in mind is if you're applying for jobs that are language specific, right? If a job asks that I want someone who speaks in Hindi, I want someone who speaks Kannada or Tamil, it's always good to mention that. So that can either come in a skill summary, or you can sort of have it as a last section. Languages known. Languages known is not a compulsory section anymore. So So that's something that you can avoid. But if a job opening or job description specifically asks for a particular language knowledge, you can sort of have that, right? And even within the language, you can have three categories. So written, oral, and sort of reading, writing, and speaking, right? So you would do three stages and you can grade it. So you can say speaking advanced, reading intermediate, writing intermediate, or if all three advanced, all three advanced, right? And you can do it for all the languages even. Let's specifically if there's a opening that requires knowledge of multiple languages, it's always good to sort of have all those languages. So if a job description requires a particular long language knowledge, include that section, and you can include it either after your education or after your work right, or internship experience. So that's completely fine, as long as you have that section and you sort of mention the languages, and you can sort of again disaggregate that into reading, writing, and speaking. I think that should be fine. But normally, if a job doesn't really say I'm looking for someone with a particular language knowledge, you don't need to include that.
Hi, Jagan. I want to know one thing.
Yeah.
That my academic performance in 10th class was poor. It was not very good. So is it necessary to put 10th class percentage in your resume? And if yes, then can we take best 4 because of the general notion, because of the general practice? Can we take the percentage of best 4 subjects and put it there? Will it be fine or not?
Okay. So, Bharat, are you in your undergrad or master's?
No, currently I'm pursuing master's.
Masters. So if you're in a master's, then you don't need to go back. You don't need to include your 12th as well. All you need to do is include your undergrad and your master's in reverse chronology. So master's first and then undergrad. You actually don't need to include your 10th and 12th, right? Because that, in some sense, that sort of, I don't really do anything with that information. So typically, I mean, it's actually advised, to matter of fact, that if you're in your master's, include only your master's and your undergrad.
Okay, thank you. But if suppose I have to do, can I take best 4 subjects? Would it be fine to do so?
That's completely fine. I think, I mean, as long as you can, I mean, you can mention it as well, top 4. And I'm guessing it's a CBSE norm, Bharat? Is that
yes,
the case?
Definitely. It's a norm everywhere. Like we use that percentage to get admissions everywhere. So
correct. So you can just say best 4 percentage, and that should be fine.
So one more thing, is it necessary to put date of birth? Like how it is going to imply it?
So you don't
going to affect your resume if you put date of birth or not?
Exactly. So you don't need to put your personal details because people typically don't ask for it unless I can only think of very weird scenarios where they're looking for people in a particular age group. If that's the case, then you may want to sort of mention it later. But otherwise, I think that's a very weird scenario. But generally, that is not the case. You don't need to actually furbish any personal details. All you need to do is your name, your email ID, your LinkedIn account, and your potentially your phone number as well. But phone number is okay if you don't want to, but email ID and LinkedIn for sure. Which means that you should always have a LinkedIn account. And always update that, right? So always keep a LinkedIn account updated.
So one more question. What if we have too many gap years? Like if we have some gap years in between in our qualifications, what to do? Like should we present something? Should we put year after our qualification? Or if we are putting a year that which year we fulfilled that qualification, should we do some explanation over there in the resume? We should fill up the gap in between. Like should we present something in resume?
Got it. Yeah. So I think gap years. So typically, you don't need to explain that in your resume per se. That's likely going to come up in your interview, right? They'll likely ask you, what did you do during the gap year? You can say either was either sort of I was preparing for an exam, or there was a personal reason, and typically that's okay, right? But I'll actually hold on to this question, because when I show you an example of sort of my CV and my resume, maybe that will become a little bit clearer. But gap years per se, you don't need to explain in a resume. That is typically a conversation that people ask you as to, okay, I see a gap year, I see a gap in your experience or in your education. What did you do back then? And that's a conversation that you can have. But in your resume and CV, you don't really need to include that.
So if there are gap years, can we decide not to put the year after the qualification, or the putting the year, the time of the qualifying is necessary to put it there?
Yes, it is. It is. So that's something that you should always do. So let's say you graduated your undergrad in 2017 and then your master's in 2019. You should do that. Let's say it's 2015 and 2019. You should do that. So you should always put the year that you graduated. So that's something that you should do.
Okay, thank you so much, Jagan.
Awesome, thanks. Yes, Vinayakan. So I see a couple of questions. So I'm an undergrad. Should I mention 12 plus details? Yes. If you're undergrad, so you're undergrad and your 12th, right? 10th is not required. And could you explain about CBSE best four role? I think Aditi's mentioned that it's the percentage for top four. Uh, ICSE, I think it's English plus 3 or 4. So depending on your board, that calculation slightly differs. But yeah, it's just the top 4 subjects that you've got the highest marks in that you do. But for ICSE, I mean, at least what when I remember I was calculating my marks, it was English plus 3 subjects or 4 subjects. But I'm not really sure what the CBSE, but Aditi sort of seems to say that it's the top 4. So I think that's what it is. Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise, then I
Jagan,
can actually, yes, Aditi.
so since you have some hiring experience and we have had this discussion earlier, but do you think mentioning one's social location is something that one should consider? I know it depends on the places that you're applying to, but do you think having it is, uh, I mean, has it started happening that people are mentioning it or not?
Right. So there is a very recent development that I've seen in the last, I think, couple of years in India, and this is something that's actually pretty common now in the US, right? So where in the JD they actually say that if you are a person of color, so POC, you can mention that, and we will look at your application favorably. So this is something that's actually being seen pretty commonly here. I'm not commonly, but very, I mean, at least to some extent, slightly more frequently than it was earlier. So if the JD does say that, or if the job opening does say that, always include it, right? Because if that's going to give you a leg up, definitely you should, right? Some applications, in fact, especially in the research space, I've seen this in the last few years with a lot more researchers coming back to India and doing their research. They actually say that we want people from a particular sort of social group, right? And then it's absolutely necessary that you do that. So it sort of depends slightly, but I mean there's still, unfortunately, there is still, I think, in the research space not so much, honestly, because there's a fair bit of sort of at least knowledge, but I think generally this is something that's a very tricky topic, right? So I would advise that
Yeah.
not to take the risk there, right? I mean, a lot of these organizations that especially research, they are sort of quote unquote progressive slash woke, how you want to put it. So they sort of would do this, right? But as a law, I think what people have started doing is they say that we do not discriminate applicants based on sex, gender, sexual orientation, social group, anything like that sort. Right? I mean, that's, in some sense they have to do it because there's a law for saying it, right? But it's a tricky topic. I think in that sense, you should be the best judge. Whether even
Yeah.
if the JD doesn't sort of mention that, whether you should mention that, I think depends on your understanding of an organization, just your reading of whether the organization will take it in the right spirit or not. right? Just that's something that's honestly very
So
sort of
for
soft
example,
information. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah,
Yes.
sorry. For example, if suppose our members have to apply for IIMB's fellowship, which is targeted to Bhujan students, so
Yeah.
where should they mention this in their CV? Because it is targeted, so they have to mention, right?
Correct. Right. So then you should add that personal section, right? Where you say where you can have your name and the social location that you sort of find yourself in. So you can have a short sort of personal information section, and that doesn't necessarily need to be at the top, because again, so you should keep in mind that this is again context specific. So if the fellowship is only open to Bahujan students, then everyone applying to that is going to be Bahujan students, right? So even within that cohort, you are still sort of going to be judged on your skills. So it's always important to keep your skills, but this information is extremely important, and you should have it not right at the top, but it's okay to maybe have it after skill summary and your education. If you're right out of your masters, it's okay to put it there. But if you have a fair bit of work experience, and if that is something that the opening is looking for, then maybe you can push it down a little, but you can add like a personal information section, and you can have your name, your contact number maybe, and your social location. Adi, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Ayushi, I see. Yes, I think that was the same. I will coincidentally answer the same question again. Ayushi, does that answer your question as well? Okay, awesome. Cool. So Karthikeya says, I have noticed that companies who care about diversity and production should record this information through a portal or a form, being mindful of privacy. Yes, some companies do. Some companies actually, if they're asking for a personal statement or a cover letter, they would actually ask you to mention it there, right? So it depends on how companies approach it. So if you're applying to a portal, there'll probably be a section there. But if there is no portal, you're applying to an email ID, which is honestly what a good chunk do even today. Then it sort of then depends on whether they ask you to mention that information in the cover letter or in the CV, and then do that, right? So yeah, so it's sort of dependent. I mean, if there's a section in the application portal itself, then you would probably do it there. But those that don't, they sort of do sort of ask you either in the cover letter or to mention it in the resume itself. Okay. So PC asks, if one is applying for PhD or a master's program and not a job, should one include why one is not interested in a particular topic in C? No, I think what you should do is, rather than mentioning, uh, okay, sorry, I think that one should, why one is, yes, you should definitely do. Sorry, I read that incorrectly. You should definitely sort of include your areas of research interest, right? And why you do this in your CV, this is actually something that you do more so in your personal statement and your statement of purpose, right? Now, there is a subtle difference between the two as well, but the research interest and sort of the kind of research that you want to do, especially in a PhD program, let's say 5 or 6 years, that is something that's sort of very important for a university that you're applying to, right? So while in the CV, you can indicate that information actually, information and the rationalization would actually go in the personal statement or statement of purpose, right? So that is where it will be placed. But it can be some kind of passing line, either through especially, let's say you have masters and you sort of have some sort of specialization, let's say financial economics. So you would say MA or MSc in economics with financial economics, or macroeconomics specialization, right? So that already indicates that that is something that you have extensive training on, and that is something that you can do. So that's sort of what it is. Yeah. Cool. So if that's the case, unless there are any other questions, uh, I'm going to share my CV, my resume first, and then maybe my CV. Yes, yes, PC, please go for it. I think you said there's one more question. Yeah. With regard to mentioning social location in a CV. Yeah. So I think, right, like I was mentioning and while answering Aditi's question as well, this is sort of dependent on what position you're applying to, right? So if the position you're applying to exclusively for Bahujan students or Bahujan sort of applicants, then it's sort of an automatic assumption that uh, that information is true, but you should still mention that, and that can come a little later in your CV or a resume, right? But if this is a position that says that sort of people from a particular social location would be given would be looked at favorably, then it's okay to place it slightly higher. Obviously, not right at the top. So you should always begin with your skills summary, but sort of then it comes down to your skill summary, potential education, and then personal information, which is where you would include your social location. Yeah. Okay. Akash says, can you explain about cover letter as to how to go about it? Yes, Akash. I think we sort of Aditya and I discussed about this. I think we want to spend a little bit of time on the CV bit, but maybe if a lot of people do want to also look at cover letters, maybe we can have another session for that as well. Maybe like a quick half-an-hour session just for cover letters, right? But if that's the case, even if that's not the case, you can reach out to me directly, and sort of we can sort of exchange emails, or we can get a call. So that should be completely fine.
Yeah, it would be great if you can conduct another session on cover letter and SOP and all. I think people will be interested.
Okay, got it. So I will maybe coordinate that with Arti, and I think she can sort of help organize that. Okay. So PC, I'm sorry, that wasn't my entire question. If it's a PhD and my interest in the subject is because of association, then yes. So PC, that's actually not per se in your CV. That will actually come in your statement of purpose, right? So if you have a particular sort of research interest, which is stemming from the background that you come from or the social location that you sort of occupy, then that is something that's where you're establishing that you're serious about the kind of research you want to do. And a lot of that seriousness in some sense is coming from the fact that that's your lived reality, right? So that is something that you should do, and that is something that you do actually in very, very detailed sort of thought and detailed writing as to why you take that research very seriously, because that's essentially outside your GRE scores, outside your letter of recommendations, and all of that. I think what universities, especially when applying for PhD, do look for is how serious you are about a particular topic, right? And that could be either stemming out of your past training, your work experience, or in this case, the example you've given is about your lived reality, right? And you can build a strong case around that. So that's necessarily not in your CV or resume, but that would come in a statement of purpose or personal statement, right? Okay. Shreya says, do we mention if we have any blogs or social media like I have for economics? Yes, I think blogs are definitely, if you have a blog that's active, you should definitely sort of include that, right? Social media, I want to be a little cautious. So if you have a social media account that is personal, where you're sort of sharing details in your personal life in terms of your general data, let's say like an Instagram or like a Snapchat, maybe you don't want to include that. But your Twitter account, by all means, I mean, if that's something that sort of you think is going to add value to your application, definitely. Otherwise, social media accounts per se, outside LinkedIn, is not really shared, but blogs for sure. If you have a blog, 100%. Social media, you can, if that is something you feel is going to add value to your application, right? So that's just my recommendation. But in general, I think people sort of don't really, outside LinkedIn, don't really share social media. Uh, Partly because of privacy, partly because that's something that's their personals, that's not related to work. But if you think that's going to add value, by all means you should. But blogs, 100%. If you have a blog, you should definitely add that, right? Okay, awesome, cool. So that being the case, I'm going to share my screen again and sort of going to show you my sort of scene. Yes, Rahul. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jagan. So while applying to the B schools, so they'll be looking for the diverse educational background, diverse social background, and diverse experience and all, right? So how we should include that in CV?
So you would typically add it in a personal information section, and that's where you can mention your social background and maybe the state you come from and all of that you can. So again, that depends specifically on, let's say, the program or the job you're applying to. If they are actively looking for the diversity, then it's always valuable to add that, right? But if that's not the case, then it's sort of, so your, especially a resume, it's honestly prime real estate, right? You have 1.5 to 2 pages, and there's always a trade-off you're going to make in terms of what I can include and what I can't include, right? So again, simple advice would be to go back to the job description and see what they're looking for. If this is something that's critical for them, by all means include that. But if that's not the case, and you have something else to include, you should definitely, and and that can be a conversation starter, Rahul, when during the interview process, right? And you can say, okay, this is sort of my lived experience, and this is sort of where I come from, and why me coming from a particular state or a particular area, and sort of my social location adds value to the kind of work that you do. And that's where you build your case in the interview. But in your resume, if that's not really asked for, then it's a trade-off that maybe you don't really need to include if you don't have enough space already. Yeah. Okay. I see Hashim again. When you were mentioning about restricting the info about your 10th and 12th, did you mean only on resume? Because some institute professors expect to see your marks from 10th onwards to see how consistent you are. Yes. If the job description asks for your 10th, 12th, undergrad, and masters, you need to include that. But typically, for the jobs, at least, so research organizations like JPAL, IFMAR, a bunch of these places, they actually don't really ask for your 10th, right? They actually just ask you what your education experience, what your education background, and what your work experience is, right? And that is sort of what you do sort of do, right? So unless it's directly asked, you don't need to include 10th and 12th. If you're in a master's, if you're in undergrad, 12th and undergrad. If you're in a master's, your undergrad and master's, right? Unless otherwise asked. If someone explicitly asks also to present a 10th and 12th results, you definitely have to do that. But otherwise, I think it's optional. You don't really do that. In fact, to the extent that if you already have masters, I think you don't really, 10th for sure, 12th you may. I think even 12th, I've actually seen that of late not being the norm anymore. So you can restrict just it to undergrad and masters. Okay, great. So I'm going to just show you an example of sort of my CV. This is actually slightly old, so and it's not extremely updated information. So typically you should use two colors and two sort of separate sort of fonts, right? And you can use italics, you can use sort of bullet points and all of that to sort of make it sort of very concise, right? So you have your name on top and typically sort of highlighted, typically in blue and bold. So it should be at least two font sizes higher than your normal text, if not larger. Then you have a mail ID, your LinkedIn information, and a Skype ID. You can include a phone number, but that is something that's optional. But if someone does ask for a contact phone number, then you should by all means, right? Then skill summary. Typically about 5 or 6. So you shouldn't have this like an extensive list, but about 5 or 6. And again, this should change based on uh, what kind of job you're applying to, right? So that is something that to keep in mind. So my sort of profile, so I've sort of graduated in 2017. Uh, so that's why my education is actually at the last. Uh, and so what I have is my current work experience. I mean, at that point, my current work experience, uh, and this is sort of what it is, right? So I was, and as you see, it's a reverse chronology. So I was a research associate from 2017 to 2019, and then a senior research associate from 2019 onwards. So it's in reverse chronology, right? And then because I was applying to places that are research organizations, I actually divided. So I sort of had a brief description of each of the project. So the project name and each of just a couple of lines of description, and also what was my responsibility there, right? And it's good to sort of have them in different fonts, so you can sort of bold, italics, just use all of these things available to just sort of make it distinguishable among each other, right? So I just have a list of my current projects, and then I have a list of my past projects, right? Again, here this is not an exhaustive list because I had a 2-page limit, and as you can see, it's exactly 2 pages. Um, I sort of have to choose between what kind of work experience I want to present, right? So this is one scenario where I had my work experience because I'd only worked in one organization before I moved to another one. So it just says work experience. But if you have multiple sort of, I mean, you have past work experience in multiple organizations, then you would actually have it nested with each other. Right? So let's say I worked at Lead at Career University, and for 2 years I would then say these are the projects I managed. Then let's say I worked in company X. In company X, what I did, right? So that's how you would sort of present your work experience there. So that's just an example of this being concise. And these are like simple sort of rules of thumb to follow, right? So if someone is looking for, okay, I want someone who has impact evaluation experience. Where do I look at? I don't need to go and read that, okay, this person's managed 7 RCTs or 5 RCTs. I don't need to do that. I say, okay, this person says that has impact evaluation and project management experience. Is that true? Right? If that's the case, then I will go and look at all of this. So I'm making it easier for the hiring manager to go to specific points and have these key buzzwords so that they know what they're looking for, where to look for. Right? Which is why this sectioning is extremely important. Right? So that is an example of sort of having sort of your resume made, right? So I think there was some question on years. So this is how you would mention your years, right? And as again here as well, your work experience. You can also actually do it for your projects, just sort of mentioning the depth with which you were involved in a project. So I think that also explains. But yeah, so that's just a quick example of what a resume could potentially. I'm by no means saying this is the only way to do it, but this is one way of doing it, right? So any questions at this point? Let me see the chat box as well. Okay, so I don't see a question at this point. Cool. So if that's the case, I can then maybe move on to showing. Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on. There is a question. Do an example of, yes, that's the next one I'm going to go to, Hashim. So I'm going to show you an example of a CV if we're okay with the resume. And while I pull that up, give me a second. Okay, so this is an example of of a CV, right? A CV is slightly long, of a CV is slightly longer. I mean, forget the typo. This was just done in a hurry for the session. But in essence, this is what you would do, right? So you would typically again have your name again. So you see same sort of so rule of thumb, use different colors and sort of have actually maybe just like shorten maybe this is yeah, so use different colors, so two colors to sort of do this, right? So in your CV you can probably sort of use this, um, and you can have like a quick summary there, um, and again your contact details can come here. Again, skill summary, you maybe want to get, so this is one example, right? If and maybe I think someone asked a question on Stata and Python, let's say for example. So you can sort of do this, right? You can have like a 1 to 5 scale and you want to maybe present it this way, right? And then work history. So this is an example of when this is a more recent CV of mine. So this is essentially sort of an example of when you have multiple work experiences. How do you sort of mention, right? And you can sort of do this. So you can nest your work experience within each other. So and as you see that this is a much longer form, and this is actually much. This is about 5-6 pages, and then there's my education, and then my publication and work in progress, right? So that's something that you can sort of do here, right? So again, so this publication and work in progress, depending on where you're applying to, can go further up or further down, depending. So this application, I mean, this CV sort of was made for a non-publication specific role. So this is what I did, right? But yeah, that's just a quick example of what a CV should look like. Should we mention a writing if none of our papers are published? Yeah, so you can say it's a work in progress. I mean, so when you mean writing, what specifically do you mean here, Subat? Reports. Yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, you can definitely set it that. So if it's sort of a report, that you can say publications or reports, and you can mention that. So that's completely fine. Right? Cool. So any questions on how to, well, write a CV or a resume, then I'm happy to sort of answer them at this point. Otherwise, so my email ID is rjagannath1993@gmail.com. Either you can write it down or you can reach out to Aditi and she should be able to sort of share my email ID. And if there's anything, if I can be of any assistance, feel free to reach out and I can definitely make time and we can definitely catch up. Yeah, I mean, if there are no other questions, Aditi, Arvind, maybe we can end the session. But I think, yeah, I mean, you can share my contact details and happy to sort of reach out. I mean, just if someone wants to reach out, more than happy to assist them.
Yeah, thank you for the session. This was an extremely informative and valuable. And we all look forward to putting the techniques we have learned today. And also the cover letter session maybe in nearby future. And
Absolutely, yes.
yeah, and I'll share your contact details with our members. And
Yes. So my email ID is yep. Awesome. Thank you so much and have a nice evening, everyone. Bye bye.
bye bye.